So, um, imagine your identity is your computer's operating system.
Right, like the base code.
Exactly. It's the foundational architecture that tells you how to process the world, right?
Hmm.
How to connect to networks, how to understand inputs, and, I mean, how to define your own boundaries.
It's your literal source code. It dictates everything.
Right, from your physical health baselines to your most, like, instinctual psychological reactions.
Because it's the unseen framework that allows you to operate in reality.
Yeah.
I mean, without a stable operating system, every single piece of incoming data is disorganized, confusing, and potentially threatening.
Yeah. Now, consider what happens when the state steps in and they completely wipe that hard drive. They install a totally different operating system and then legally, permanently forbid you from ever accessing your original source code again.
Wow.
They don't just give you new software, you know.
Uh.
They tell you the old hardware never even existed.
It's a systemic overwrite. And the consequences of that overwrite are not just administrative hiccups. They are profoundly psychological. It fundamentally alters the neurobiology of the individual. And those alterations, they echo violently across generations. I mean, you cannot simply overwrite human biology with a legal contract and expect the system to run smoothly.
You really can't. And that is exactly why we are here today. Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're undertaking a comprehensive, unhurried exploration into the profound, lifelong impacts of Australia's family separation policies.
We're looking at a crisis that has, directly or indirectly, affected over 1 million Australians across 3 generations.
It's massive. And to understand this, we're looking at a stack of deeply revealing source materials today. We have a commissioner roles and gaps analysis document. We've got internal letters from various government departments,
Including a deeply telling response from the Attorney General's department, right? The one dated March 26, 2026.
Yes, that one is wild. We'll get to that.
Mm-hmm.
We're also looking at analytical reports on the systemic exclusion of adoptees from the vocational education and training sector, or the VET sector.
And crucially, we are looking at an incredibly powerful primary source note. It's this first-hand account detailing the leaked mechanics of what the author calls colonial psychology.
Right. And our mission today, really, is to bridge the gap. We have to connect the massive macro-level systemic failures of family separation with the micro-level, like deeply personal, lived reality of coercive control.
Because you cannot truly grasp the scale of the policy failure until you understand the intimate domestic human cost. It's just impossible.
Exactly. So to anchor this whole conversation, I want to introduce the core thesis presented in these materials. It's a heavy academic statement, but it really frames everything we're about to discuss.
What's the thesis?
The author asserts this. Adoption is the ontological and epistemological fault line of colonial psychology.
Okay, let's break that down because it is a brilliant, if devastating, distillation.
Yeah, please do.
So ontological refers to the nature of being, right? Who you actually are, your fundamental existence in the world. And epistemological refers to how you know what you know. It's your access to truth and your ability to trust your own reality.
Okay, I'm tracking.
So the author is arguing that the practice of adoption, as implemented by the state, fundamentally fractures both of those pillars. It breaks your reality, and it breaks your ability to know your own truth. You are told you are one thing, but your biology, your nervous system, tells you another.
And to make that abstract philosophical concept incredibly concrete for you, the listener, the primary source shares this staggering, almost unbelievable irony.
This part really got me.
It's wild.
Yeah.
The author is a white-presenting stolen adoptee. They suffered total identity erasure, just a complete and legally enforced severing from their biological roots. Yet their biological father is Mark Moffatt.
And for those who might not immediately recognize the name, Mark Moffatt is the legendary producer behind the iconic Yothu Yindi song Treaty.
Yeah. I really want you to let that sink in. The biological son of the man who helped produce one of the most culturally significant Australian anthems about Indigenous land rights, identity, and sovereignty. A song literally called Treaty is himself a victim of a system that enacted total identity erasure.
It's incredible.
He was stripped of his own sovereign truth by the very same colonial mechanisms. It's hard to even wrap your head around.
It perfectly encapsulates that fault line of colonial psychology we were just talking about.
Yeah.
The system is so pervasive, so deeply entrenched in its mechanics of separation and assimilation that it completely overwrites individual reality.
Regardless of the profound cultural or biological ties that might exist beneath the surface.
Exactly. It is a literal manifestation of the state deciding it has the supreme authority to author a human life, to erase a profound biological lineage and just, replace it with a state-sanctioned fiction.
It is staggering. I mean, the layers of irony and tragedy there are almost too dense to unpack quickly. But if we are going to understand how this massive bureaucratic system operates, we first have to ground our discussion in the lived human reality, right?
I completely agree. Policy does not exist in a vacuum. It exists in living rooms, in kitchens, in the quiet, unseen moments of a family's daily life.
Exactly. We have to look at the micro-reality of forced separation. We have to look at what happens inside the house. And the primary source note gives us a harrowing, intimate look at how state-sanctioned secrecy breeds domestic coercive control.
It really does.
The author details an adoptive mother who utilized financial coercion and outright blackmail as a primary tool of abuse. The threat was instant disinheritance.
Wow.
And this wasn't just like a general threat, right? It was a known, weaponized consequence if the adoptee ever dared to seek the truth about their biological origins.
Financial control is, of course, a classic pillar of domestic coercive control. But in the specific context of adoption, it takes on a uniquely cruel dimension.
How so?
Well, we have to understand the power dynamic here. The state has already stripped the adoptee of their biological family, their original name, their medical history. The adoptive family is, legally and practically, their only lifeline to societal stability.
Right, they hold all the cards.
Exactly. So when the adoptee expresses a desire to know their own biological truth, which, by the way, is a fundamental, innate human drive, it is positioned by the adoptive parent as an act of ultimate betrayal.
And that supposed betrayal is punishable by financial and familial ruin. The psychological abuse, according to the materials, escalated to the point where the adoptive parent was issuing these ultimatums before the search for the biological mother had even formally begun.
Right. So just the idea that the adoptee might want to know where they came from was enough to trigger financial blackmail.
How does a person even begin to process that? You're an adult, seeking your own basic medical and historical context, and the person who raised you says, if you look at your own shadow, I will destroy your future.
It forces the adoptee into a state of perpetual hypervigilance. They learn that their basic human curiosity, their need for self-actualization, is dangerous. It threatens their survival.
It's like walking on eggshells for your entire life.
Yes. This is how the state's legal demand for secrecy trickles down into psychological warfare within the home. The adoptive parent feels emboldened to use these tactics because the state itself has validated the idea that the biological family must remain hidden at all costs.
And then the materials describe a moment that the author calls the rupture of reunion. The adoptee actually managed to find their biological mother.
A huge moment.
Huge. They returned to their adoptive home, carrying the excitement and the profound emotional weight of this discovery. They brought flowers and gifts for their adoptive parents, attempting to share this massive life event. And the reaction?
What happened?
The adoptive father could not even look them in the eye. That single moment, the author notes, marked the absolute irreparable rupture of the adoptive relationship.
The inability to make eye contact is deeply psychologically revealing. What's fascinating here is that it is the physical manifestation of a profound psychological collapse.
A collapse of the adoptive father's reality.
Exactly. His reality, this closed, airtight system where he was the one and only father, a system built entirely on the legal fiction provided by the state, was suddenly and undeniably breached by biological truth.
Right. By looking the adoptee in the eye, he'd have to acknowledge it.
Yes, he'd have to acknowledge the reality of the biological mother. He'd have to acknowledge that the adoptee is an independent human being with a history that predates the adoption contract.
And instead of feeling joy or empathy for the adoptee's monumental discovery, the reaction is complete withdrawal. It's a refusal to witness the adoptee's true self.
It's incredibly sad.
But here is where the narrative takes a turn that I found almost incomprehensible. The deepest irony buried in this primary source is the background of the adoptive mother, the one enforcing this financial blackmail, the one weaponizing the control.
Right.
She was, herself, a mother of loss to forced adoption.
That is a profoundly devastating detail, and it is crucial to understanding the cyclical nature of this trauma.
It's just so hard to wrap my head around.
We're talking about an adoptive mother who was herself a victim of the brutal forced adoption era. She had a child taken from her by the state. Logically, from a distance, you would assume this would breed profound empathy, right?
Exactly. You'd think she'd understand better than anyone.
She knows intimately the exact cellular pain of maternal separation. But as the psychological evidence shows us, trauma does not operate on a logic board. When trauma is completely unresolved, unsupported, and shrouded in state-enforced shame, it doesn't always lead to empathy. In this case, her grief inverted.
Inverted grief. That is such a striking phrase. What does that actually look like in practice? Because instead of empathy, the materials show it became deep, weaponized denial.
Inverted grief happens when the pain of a loss is so catastrophic and so entirely invalidated by society that the psyche cannot process it.
It just breaks.
Yes. To survive, the individual subconscious projects that pain outward. Instead of mourning the child she lost, she fiercely guards the child she was given, but she does so through the lens of her original trauma.
Okay, I see.
She becomes terrified of separation, but instead of nurturing connection, she attempts to control the environment absolutely. The adoptee's desire for their biological roots triggers her unresolved trauma of having her own biological child taken. So she attacks the adoptee to protect her own fragile, constructed reality.
And the attacks were horrifying. The source details how this adoptive mother actively weaponized blame. She blamed the adoptee for her own breast cancer.
Oh my God.
Which is an astonishing thing to say to a child you raised, but it mirrors a trauma from 4 years prior where the adoptee was blamed for their own son's brain tumors.
That projection of blame is a textbook hallmark of deeply unresolved complex trauma. When an individual is carrying an unbearable burden of shame and grief, often shame placed on them by the societal stigma of being an unwed mother during the forced adoption era, they will look for any external target to carry that weight.
Just offloading the pain.
Blaming the adoptee for cancer, blaming the adoptee for their child's illness, it is a desperate, toxic attempt to make the adoptee the source of all pain, thereby absolving herself of the internal agony she has carried for decades.
And the tragedy is that it did not stop there. The materials outline how, over the years, the adoptive mother actively intervened to cause estrangement between the adoptee and their own children.
So she was weaponizing her unresolved trauma to perpetuate the exact cycle of separation onto the next generation.
Yes, she experienced forced separation and then orchestrated forced separation between her adopted child and their children.
Precisely. The trauma is contagious when it is kept in the dark. The author writes, "I have nothing left of my old adoptive life. It is a total scorched earth severance."
I want to pause here because this requires us to really challenge a pervasive societal myth. Let's unpack this. If adoption is universally pitched to us as a fairy tale rescue, an act of pure, unadulterated altruism and love, the ultimate win-win scenario, how do we reconcile that with a system that inherently arms adoptive parents with the legal and financial tools to blackmail an adult over their own biology?
We reconcile it by understanding that the fairy tale is not a description of reality. It is a socially engineered narrative.
Right, it's a PR.
It is a shield designed to protect the system and the industry from critique. The psychological reality on the ground is vastly different. What the primary source is describing maps perfectly onto a severe clinical concept known as EPKC, enduring personality change after catastrophic experience.
EPKC. I have to admit, before looking at these materials, I had never heard of that diagnosis. It sounds incredibly severe.
It is. EPKCE is a diagnosis in the International Classification of Diseases that captures enduring, rigid, and maladaptive personality changes that last for years following a catastrophic, prolonged stressor. Historically, it is most often discussed in the context of prisoners of war, survivors of concentration camps, or victims of prolonged hostage situations.
Wait, really? You are saying the psychological profile of an adoptee raised in a secretive, coercively controlling environment mirrors the psychological profile of a prisoner of war?
Yes. And the materials argue this is a highly accurate framework for understanding the isolated survivors of adoption. Think about the mechanics of the trauma.
Okay.
It begins with infant separation. Psychologist Dr. Alan Shore, a leading expert on attachment neurobiology, identifies this as profound preverbal trauma.
Preverbal, meaning before they can even speak or understand what's happening.
Exactly. The infant is removed from the maternal biosphere, the scent, the heartbeat, the auditory rhythms they knew in utero.
Right.
Because they do not have language yet, this trauma is not stored as a narrative memory.
It's not like remembering a bad day.
Right. It is stored as somatic memory, as motor patterns, as a dysregulated nervous system, as a persistent baseline of terror.
So the body keeps the score, essentially. The hardware remembers the wipe, even if the new software doesn't have the file.
That's a perfect way to phrase it. So you have a foundational pre-verbal trauma. Then, the infant is placed into an environment of ongoing relational complexity, secrecy, and often, as we've seen, emotional abuse.
The pressure cooker environment.
Yes. The child is implicitly or explicitly told they must be grateful, they must perform the role of the biological child, and they must never question their origins. When you combine foundational identity trauma with a prolonged, inescapable environment where the victim is dependent on their captors in this case, the adoptive parents holding all legal and financial power, you develop complex PTSD.
Let's differentiate that for the listener, because people throw PTSD around a lot.
Mhm.
CPTSD is fundamentally different from standard PTSD, right?
Very different. Standard PTSD is generally tied to a single acute traumatic event, a car crash, a natural disaster, a single violent assault. You had a baseline personality, the event happened, and now you were experiencing flashbacks and hypervigilance related to that specific event.
So the goal of therapy is often to return the person to their pre-trauma baseline.
Right, but with adoption, there is no pre-trauma baseline.
Exactly. The trauma happened when the baseline was being built.
Exactly. Complex PTSD stems from chronic, long-term exposure to trauma where the victim feels trapped, often in childhood. For an adoptee, the trauma happens at the foundational level of identity formation. The severance occurred before the personality was even formed.
Wow.
Therefore, the CPTSD manifests as severe difficulties with emotional regulation, chronic dissociation, and a fractured sense of self. The individual often views themselves as fundamentally damaged or permanently contaminated.
So it is a massive disservice to frame this as just having a tough childhood. The materials are arguing that this is a spiritual and experiential neurodivergence caused entirely by state-mandated severance.
Yes, it creates a permanent state of ambiguous loss and disenfranchised grief.
Disenfranchised grief. Let's dig into that.
Disenfranchised grief is a crucial concept here. It means your grieving does not fit society's rules. Society dictates that an adoptee should be eternally grateful for being saved.
Right. You're supposed to be the lucky one.
So when the adoptee grieves the loss of their original identity, their biological mother, their lineage, a grief adoptees often refer to as a death of self, society refuses to acknowledge it. Friends, family, and even therapists might say, but your adoptive parents gave you a good life.
Which is so invalidating.
Completely. This total lack of acknowledgement isolates the adoptee further. It prolongs the emotional pain, leading to deep internal instability. You are mourning a ghost that everyone else insists never existed.
And if we look at the big picture, this micro-level psychological abuse, this domestic coercive control, it didn't just organically sprout out of nowhere. The materials link this directly to the macro-level policy known as the clean break theory implemented by the state.
Yes, the clean break theory. This was the absolute dominant social work philosophy regarding adoption between the 1950s and the 1970s, though its echoes definitely persist today.
And what was the core idea there?
The core idea was brutal in its simplicity. To completely suppress the child's birth identity, sever all ties with the biological family, and create a legitimate blank slate for the adoptive parents. The state believed that if they just legally erased the past, the child would seamlessly assimilate into the new family as if born to them.
But that is hubris on a monumental scale. I mean, you cannot legislate away biology. You cannot write a law that cancels out pre-verbal trauma.
Precisely. By mandating total secrecy, the state essentially mandated shame. They signaled that the child's origins were too sordid or shameful to ever be discussed.
And that state-sanctioned shame created the exact domestic conditions for the coercive control and averted grief we discussed.
Yes, the state built the pressure cooker, they locked the lid, turned up the heat, and then walked away, leaving the adoptive parents and the child to deal with the explosive psychological consequences.
Which brings us to perhaps the most maddening part of this deep dive. So what does this all mean for how the government acts today? If the state built the pressure cooker, how does society manage this level of continuous intergenerational trauma today? How does the government respond to a crisis that has, by their own design, affected over 1 million people?
Well, they manage it through a sophisticated system of structural ignorance. They manage it through bureaucratic deflection.
Let's dig into the evidence for that, because it's pretty damning. We have a letter here dated March 26, 2026, from the Australian Government Attorney General's Department.
Right.
This was a direct response to a prominent advocate, Shane Boole, who submitted a comprehensive proposal for the creation of a dedicated National Social Justice Commissioner for Family Separation and Reconnection.
This letter is a masterclass in institutional evasion. It is a textbook example of how the perimeter of power defends itself from accountability. The analytical documents call this polite bureaucratic deflection.
I want to read a bit of this letter so you, the listener, can hear exactly how this sounds, because it's infuriating. It starts by acknowledging the advocate's correspondence. Then it gives these sweeping boilerplate reassurances.
Classic PR.
It says, quote, "The government believes that all Australians are entitled to respect and dignity. Australia is committed to ensuring children in Australia are able to enjoy the rights set out in the Convention on the Rights of the Child." End quote. It sounds very measured, very compassionate.
It is the standard lexicon of human rights public relations. It's designed to pacify the reader.
But then comes the actual deflection. They acknowledge his request for a new dedicated commissioner to handle family separation, but instead of engaging with the need, they point to existing roles. The letter states, "The department also notes the commission's existing work, including work led by the National Children's Commissioner, Deb Sorberis, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner, Katie Kiss." And then they basically thank him for his time and close the file.
On the surface, to a layperson or a busy politician, that might sound like a perfectly reasonable response. We already have commissioners looking at child welfare and Indigenous issues, so the bases are covered.
What they're not covered.
Not at all. The Commissioner Roles and Gaps analysis document that we are looking at rigorously deconstructs why this is a massive systemic failure of accountability. Pointing to those two specific commissioners is not proof of coverage. It is actual proof of the accountability vacuum.
So let's break that down piece by piece.
Yeah.
Why is relying on Deb Sorberis, the National Children's Commissioner, completely insufficient for this crisis?
Because her statutory mandate is strictly legally restricted to individuals aged 0 to 18. Her entire operational focus is on early intervention, youth justice, and current child maltreatment.
Okay, 0 to 18.
Yeah.
But the trauma we're talking about.
Exactly. The trauma of forced adoption and family separation is, as we've established, a lifelong chronic event. The profound need for access to original records, identity restoration, psychological uncoupling from abusive adoptive contracts, and specialized therapeutic support does not magically evaporate on an adoptee's 18th birthday.
In fact, that is often when the crisis accelerates, right, as the adult tries to navigate the world independently.
Yes. By pointing to the Children's Commissioner, the federal government is effectively washing its hands of adult care leavers and historical forced adoptees. They absorb the grievance at the childhood level, but they provide zero oversight, zero accountability, and zero recourse for the adult outcomes of their policies.
It's like saying, we care deeply about you while you are a minor in our system, but the minute you age out and have to deal with the lifelong trauma we caused, you are entirely on your own.
It's abandonment, frankly.
And what about Katie Kiss, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner? Why doesn't that cover the gap?
Well, her mandate is absolutely vital and irreplaceable. She monitors the human rights of Indigenous Australians, focusing heavily on the catastrophic impacts of the stolen generations and the deeply concerning contemporary overrepresentation of Indigenous children in out-of-home care.
Right.
But her mandate is, by definition and necessity, exclusive to Indigenous populations.
So if you follow the logic of the Attorney General's Department, by relying only on these two existing roles, the government is deliberately leaving hundreds of thousands of non-Indigenous adult care leavers, mothers of forced adoption, and historical adoptees with literally nowhere to go.
Exactly. There is no federal desk, no office, no commissioner where the buck stops for their specific lifelong trauma. They fall completely through the cracks. And the analytical materials give us a framework for understanding how this happens. They call this bureaucratic absorption. It is the first of what they describe as the three walls of institutional silence.
The three walls of institutional silence. Let's go through those, because once you see them, you realize how intentionally they are built.
They're very deliberate.
We have bureaucratic absorption, which is what we just analyzed, redirecting legitimate grievances into administrative dead ends where the statutory mandate doesn't fit the actual problem. What is the second wall?
The second wall is moral shielding. This is perhaps the most insidious. This is where the system utilizes the rhetoric of salvation, rescue, and the best interests of the child to completely immunize the industry from accountability.
I see.
Because adoption is culturally framed as a moral upgrade, taking a child from a bad or poor situation and placing them in a good or wealthy family. Any critique of the structural psychological harms of the system is immediately deflected as an attack on care itself.
So if you criticize adoption, you are accused of not caring about vulnerable children.
Yes. As the advocate so brilliantly puts it, the state baptizes control as compassion.
Baptizing control as compassion. That perfectly encapsulates how you can legally erase someone's identity and tell them they should be grateful for it. And what is the third wall?
The third wall is diffusion of responsibility. This relies on jurisdictional fragmentation. In Australia, the Commonwealth government holds the international human rights treaty obligations, like the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child.
Okay, the federal level.
But the individual states and territories administer the actual child protection, foster care, and adoption systems. So when an adult survivor seeks redress or systemic change, the federal government points to the states and says, it's a state operational issue.
And let me guess, the states point right back.
You got it. The states point back to the federal government and say, we need federal leadership and funding. The responsibility is endlessly diffused, meaning no one ever has to actually fix the problem.
Which perfectly explains the maddening reality we are sitting in right now. We are 13 years removed from the 2013 National Apology for Forced Adoptions. 13 years. And the landscape is littered with broken promises.
It's tragic.
The materials point out that the Forced Adoption Support Services, or FASS, are critically underutilized. A post-implementation review in 2018 showed minimal uptake and widespread dissatisfaction. The government allocated funds, but the lived experience stakeholders, the actual survivors, have virtually no voice in how those funds are used or how the services are designed.
Because an apology is completely empty if it is not followed by structural, legally binding reform. Apologies without systemic change are just public relations exercises designed to manage the state's image, not heal the victims.
There's a really fascinating piece of illustrative content in the sources that highlights this exact frustration. It's a LinkedIn post from Sue Ann Hunter, celebrating the passing of the National Commission for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Children and Young People Bill 2026.
I remember this one.
She writes, quote, "This new commission recognizes a simple truth. You cannot fix systems that separate children from family without independent oversight, accountability, and lived experience voices at the center," end quote.
Which is an entirely true statement and a massive, hard-fought victory for First Nations advocacy. The logic is unassailable.
But look at how the advocate in our materials responds to that exact post. They apply that unassailable logic to the rest of the population. They say, if we can do this here, we can do it properly across the entire system. The same principle must now extend nationally.
Right.
Forced adoption, foster care, kinship disruption. These systems impact a huge portion of the broader population across generations. Yet, outside of the First Nations context, there is no dedicated independent authority to address family separation as a unified national human rights issue.
It creates a bifurcated system of human rights where the state acknowledges the necessity of oversight for one specific demographic, but actively denies the exact same principle for hundreds of thousands of others suffering from the exact same structural mechanisms of family separation.
So how do we visualize this bureaucratic evasion? Think about it this way. Imagine you discover a massive toxic chemical spill in the middle of the open ocean, killing off entire ecosystems.
Yeah.
You rush to report it to the environmental agency. And the government writes back, "Thank you for your concern. We want you to know we have an excellent, well-funded department dedicated to monitoring freshwater streams and a fantastic task force doing great work protecting coral reefs near the shore."
Wow. Yes.
It is technically true, they do have those departments, but it completely, willfully, and aggressively ignores the actual massive crisis in the open ocean.
That is precisely what is happening with the Attorney General's response. It is a deliberate, calculated choice to maintain a policy vacuum where adult survivors are left to drown.
And if the federal government is maintaining this vacuum, we have to look at what the state governments are doing inside that void. Because they aren't just sitting idle, they are actively enforcing the trauma. Which brings us to the mechanics of legal identity erasure.
This is where we examine the actual tools of epistemic violence. The foundational tool for all of this, the mechanism that makes the clean break theory a legal reality, is the amended birth certificate, or the ABC.
The materials refer to the ABC as a legal fiction. Can you walk us through the actual mechanics of how this document works? Because it's truly Orwellian.
It really is. When an infant is formally adopted, the state takes their original factual birth certificate, the one that lists the biological mother who actually labored and gave birth to them, and they cancel it. They seal it away in a vault.
Locked away.
Then the Registry of Births, Deaths, and Marriages issues a new document, the amended birth certificate. But it doesn't say adopted by. It literally legally lists the adoptive parents as the biological parents who gave birth to the child.
It is state-sanctioned historical revisionism. It retroactively negates the biological truth of a human being's origins.
Exactly. The advocate sources describe this as a gross misjustice of truth that fundamentally lacks integrity and authenticity. It's not just a piece of administrative paper. It is the legal laundering of a human identity.
Legal laundering.
It forces the adoptee to carry a fraudulent document for the rest of their life, presenting it for passports, driver's licenses, and employment, participating in their own erasure every single time.
And what is truly wild is how fiercely the state governments protect this fiction. The materials point to archaic state-level secrecy laws. Victoria's Adoption Act 1984 is highlighted specifically.
Yes, Victoria.
These laws explicitly prohibit general access to adoption records. They carve out massive exceptions to transparency, reserving control of the records to specific, heavily guarded administrative bodies.
Because if they allowed open access, the fiction would collapse. So an adult adoptee cannot just use standard right to information or freedom of information laws to get their own historical file. They are uniquely barred from their own truth.
Which is mind-blowing.
These archaic laws legally reinforce the clean break theory by subjugating the fundamental human right to identity. Even information and privacy commissioners are technically hamstrung. They cannot override these specific localized state adoption acts.
Let's talk about the concept of discharging an adoption, because this is where the contract law aspect becomes incredibly dark. Say you are an adult adoptee. You are 30, 40 years old. You've experienced the trauma, the estrangement, the inverted grief, and financial blackmail we discussed earlier. You want out.
Right. You want to dissolve it.
You want to legally sever ties with the adoptive family, regain your original name, and restore your original birth certificate. The materials highlight that no fault, no fee discharges are functionally impossible in Australia.
Adoptees are effectively legally trapped in these contracts. If you want to discharge an adoption, there is no simple administrative path to just go to a registry and say, I am an adult, I no longer consent to this arrangement.
So what do you have to do?
You are forced to initiate a grueling process in a Supreme Court. You often have to prove exceptional circumstances or severe documented fault or abuse by the adoptive parents. It requires lawyers, thousands of dollars, and years of litigation, re-traumatizing the survivor at every step.
Wait, let's look at this through the lens of basic contract law. If a core non-negotiable tenet of modern contract law is the concept of informed consent and capacity, how in the world can a lifelong, legally binding identity contract be permanently enforced upon someone who was literally days or weeks old when it was signed on their behalf?
You have hit on the exact sovereignty critique that the advocates are raising. It is legally anomalous. The state is acting as an absolute epistemic gatekeeper. They are deciding what knowledge is allowed to exist and who is allowed to own their own identity.
It's so patronizing.
And the disparity in how the Registry of Births, Deaths, and Marriages handles identity corrections for different demographics is glaring and deeply hypocritical.
The sources provide a really stark contemporary example of this disparity. A Queensland Member of Parliament, Joan Pease, rightly championed state reforms to make it easier for trans and gender-diverse people to change their birth certificates to reflect their authentic lived selves.
Right.
She was celebrated for this, and it is, of course, a necessary and vital human rights reform based on self-determination.
Absolutely necessary. The state recognized that forcing someone to carry identity documents that do not align with their true self causes profound psychological harm. But observe how that exact same principle is violently denied to adoptees.
Right. Adoptees and their biological families saw this progressive reform and went to Joan Pease's public Facebook page. They essentially said, "This is fantastic. We completely agree that identity documents should reflect truth. Can we, as adopted adults who are in full reunion with our biological families, have the exact same right? Can we simply correct our birth certificates to reflect our original biological truth without going to the Supreme Court?"
And what did she do?
What did Joan Pease do? She didn't just ignore them. She deleted their comments and blocked them from her page.
She actively silenced and blocked an entire family in her electorate for asking for the exact same human right she was championing for others. This perfectly, devastatingly illustrates the knowledge power nexus operating within the state. The progressive state is willing to streamline identity rectification for gender, recognizing the imperative of self-determination there. But it fundamentally, aggressively refuses to recognize the self-determination of the adoptee.
Why? Why is the adoption contract treated as so uniquely sacred? Why does the state guard this legal fiction so fiercely that a progressive politician will block her own constituents rather than address it?
To understand that, we have to pull in a sociological concept, biopower, a term coined by the French philosopher Michel Foucault.
Okay, biopower. Break that down for us.
Biopower refers to the techniques and strategies the state uses to regulate its populations, managing births, deaths, reproduction, and fundamentally the definition of family. The state uses adoption as a primary mechanism of biopower.
So they use it to shape society.
Exactly. It allows the state to define who belongs, who is legitimate, and what constitutes an acceptable family unit. It is a tool for social engineering, moving children from marginalized demographics into demographics the state deems appropriate.
So to allow an adult adoptee to simply fill out a form and revert an adoption to say, the state got it wrong, my biological family is my real family, threatens the state's foundational authority over kinship.
Exactly. It threatens the entire legal and moral architecture that justifies the state's ability to sever families in the first place. If the state admits the adoption contract is flawed and can be easily dissolved by the victim, the state loses its ultimate authority over the definition of family.
Wow.
So the adoptee isn't just fighting a stubborn bureaucracy, they are fighting the state's desperate assertion that it owns their kinship.
That is a terrifying realization. The state owns your family ties. And if the legal system is built from the ground up to enforce this silence and protect the state's biopower, how does the education system handle it? Are they teaching care workers about this trauma?
That's the logical next question.
All right, let's move to the vocational education and training sector, the VET system.
This is a crucial pivot because the VET system is the workforce pipeline. It trains the frontline workers for aged care, early childhood education, and critically, the massive National Disability Insurance Scheme, the NDIS.
The materials contain extensive correspondence from an advocate to jobs and skills councils, specifically a national body called Human Ability. Human Ability is responsible for designing the national curriculum for the care and support sectors.
And what was the advocate asking for?
The advocates have been pleading with them for years to include adoption-specific trauma in the mandatory training for care workers.
Because, as we established with the EPCCE and CPTSD diagnoses, forced adoption trauma results in severe, complex psychosocial disabilities. If you are training someone to be a community service worker, a mental health peer worker, or a disability support worker interacting with NDIS participants, they absolutely must be trained in how to recognize and handle that specific trauma.
Or else they do more harm.
If they aren't, they risk severely re-traumatizing the individual through ignorance of their triggers.
But currently, the curriculum fails completely. There is a specific training unit, CHCMHS013, which is literally titled Implement Trauma-Informed Care. You would think this is exactly where it goes.
You'd hope so.
But it completely omits any mention of adoption. It covers general interpersonal violence, it covers child abuse, but there is zero mention of the profound psychological and identity-based complexities of a child legally removed from their mother by the state.
The advocate refers to this as a catastrophic lack of adoption-critical education, and the institutional response from Human Ability has been the classic bureaucratic absorption wall.
Right, the deflection.
They reply with generic, automated-sounding emails saying, "We've taken your feedback on board along with submissions from 1,000 other stakeholders." They dilute the specific, urgent human rights plea into a vast sea of generic bureaucratic feedback, neutralizing it entirely.
I want to share what I found to be the most stunning, almost sickening irony in the entire stack of materials. The advocate, trying to prove how ignored this issue is, searched the entire national training website for the word adoption. Do you know what the only national curriculum is that meaningfully references adoption?
What's fascinating here is it is genuinely hard to believe, but it is the Certificate 4 in Greyhound racing industry.
Let that sink in. We have a national training standard for the ethical adoption and rehoming of racing dogs, but we refuse to mandate training on the lifelong psychological safety and trauma of human children separated from their biological families.
It's absurd.
It is an astonishing indictment of our societal priorities.
Sociologist Johan Galtung would define this as the intersection of structural and cultural violence. Structural violence is when institutions, by their very design and curriculum, prevent certain vulnerable groups from getting what they need to survive and heal.
Like the curriculum omitting adoption.
Yes. The bureaucratic machinery of Human Ability itself becomes an instrument of violence through omission. Cultural violence is the sanitization of reality, omitting the words forced adoption from the curriculum to make the state's violence seem natural, normal, or simply non-existent.
The sources argue that bodies like human ability actively embrace a hierarchy of vulnerability. They will set up dedicated steering committees for mental health peer workers, which is fantastic and necessary, but they completely erase the lived experience of forced adoptees from that same framework.
Creating a caste system of trauma.
Yes, defining what is an acceptable lived experience to teach and what is unacceptable because it challenges the state's adoption narrative.
And while the VET sector is busy ignoring genuine advocates and sanitizing the curriculum, it has simultaneously been actively exploited by massive fraudulent operations. This is where the curriculum failure intersects catastrophically with the NDIS crisis.
Right, the ASQE crackdown. The Australian Skills Quality Authority, which is the national regulator for the VET sector, recently had to step in and void over 30,000 qualifications from fraudulent training providers, these so-called ghost colleges.
These ghost colleges were essentially criminal production lines. They were issuing certificates in high-risk, high-demand sectors like disability support and aged care with virtually no oversight.
So no classes, no exam.
No classes attended, no exams passed, just fast-tracked recognition of prior learning for a fee. They weaponized the state's accreditation process to sell licenses to work in high-consequence sectors.
So layer this together. You have a national curriculum that already fundamentally fails to teach care workers about complex adoption trauma. And then on top of that inadequate baseline, you have 30,000 workers entering the system who didn't even get the baseline training. They literally just bought the paper.
Exactly. It highlights a massive systemic fracture between government regulators. A2R is supposed to regulate the training quality, but the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission passively relies on those A2 stamp certificates as definitive proof of competence.
Oh, wow.
So when A2 finally catches up to the fraud and voids those 30,000 qualifications, they abruptly transfer an enormous unmanaged public safety risk directly onto the NDIS participants.
The most vulnerable people in our society, those relying on the NDIS for their daily survival, are suddenly being cared for by a workforce whose foundational training is demonstrably compromised and who wouldn't know how to handle adoption trauma even if they had taken the real classes.
It's a disaster.
The materials note that the advocate wrote to the federal minister saying, "I am not angry, I am outraged." And when you see the mechanics of it, you understand the outrage.
The entire VET system operates in a perpetual state of regulatory fatigue. We saw this exact same cycle with the VET FELP scandals a decade ago. Fraudsters exploit the loopholes, the regulator spends years playing catch-up, a mass cancellation of qualifications happens, and the immense risk is simply passed down the line to the end user, the vulnerable patient.
While the actual training needs are ignored.
Meanwhile, the complex, nuanced training that actual vulnerable cohorts desperately need is completely ignored because it doesn't fit neatly into the high-volume, low-margin business model of the training providers.
We know that modern governments run on data. Right? They constantly justify their policies by claiming to be data-driven and evidence-based. So if they aren't teaching this trauma in the schools and they aren't addressing it through commissioners, are they at least measuring it? Are they tracking the fallout?
This is where we see how policy and action is mathematically engineered. The primary national statistical publication that informs policymakers is the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare's report, titled Adoptions Australia.
And what does that report actually measure? Because the title sounds comprehensive.
It is entirely misleading. It focuses incredibly narrowly on formal legal adoptions that are finalized in the current reporting year. In Australia right now, because of shifts in policy toward out-of-home care, that is only a few hundred formal adoptions per year.
A few hundred. But wait, at the top of Deep Dive, we established this crisis impacts over 1 million people. The sources state there are upwards of 250,000 historical forced adoptions. Does the AIHW data track the lifelong outcomes of those 250,000 people?
No. Historical forced adoptions are almost entirely excluded from the ongoing statistical narrative of the report.
Okay. Does it track the massive ongoing modern crisis of out-of-home care, or OOHC, where tens of thousands of children are separated from their kin and placed in foster care, but not formally legally adopted?
No. It systematically excludes them from this data set because they do not count as a finalized adoption event.
So it's just a massive blind spot.
But the data the government relies on is purely quantitative, based entirely on administrative legal events. It provides zero qualitative insight into the lifelong human cost. It does not track intergenerational trauma, it does not track the horrifying links to the stolen generations, and it explicitly fails to measure long-term adult outcomes like the rates of homelessness, incarceration, or suicide among care leavers.
So the data deficit isn't an accident. It is a feature, not a bug. By only counting the final paperwork of a few hundred formal adoptions, the state completely obscures the reality of mass kinship disruption. As the old management saying goes, you cannot manage what you refuse to measure.
Exactly. If you don't measure the trauma doesn't exist on the balance sheet. Precisely. Because if the data accurately reflected the lifelong outcomes of state intervention, if an AIHW report clearly linked state-mandated family separation to skyrocketing rates of CPTSD, addiction, and systemic poverty, the current policy approach would be politically and legally indefensible.
The sources refer to the current system as punitive, not supportive. They point at a staggering fiscal disparity. The state will happily spend upwards of $25,000 a year to keep a single child in foster care. In cases of intensive residential care, they will spend $16,000 a month.
It's an industry.
But they will absolutely refuse to spend a one-time grant of $500 on proactive family preservation, like emergency housing, a fridge, or utility assistance for a struggling biological mother to keep her child.
It highlights a deep fiscal pathology within the child protection system. The system heavily incentivizes placement over preservation. The analytical materials argue there is a deeply entrenched trisectoral nexus.
Trisectoral nexus.
This is an alliance between massive corporate wealth generators, powerful religious organizations that run the agencies, and the state-sponsored adoption and foster care market. Children are functionally transformed into high-revenue assets. The system generates massive immediate funding for the agencies, but it completely ignores the long-term societal debts, the cost of the trauma, and simply transfers those uncosted debts onto the adoptee's future.
I have to ask the cynical question here. Is this data gap just standard bureaucratic incompetence, or is it a deliberate protective shield? Because if the comprehensive data show that the out-of-home care system acts as a direct pipeline to mass societal failure in the prison system, the entire multi-million-dollar adoption industrial complex would be exposed.
To answer that, we have to look at where the system is heading right now. We are watching the aggressive modernization of the clean break theory. We are entering the digital frontier of family separation. The materials detail a horrifying new trend, the rise of algorithmic child removal.
Algorithmic child removal. That sounds like something out of a dystopian sci-fi novel. How does an algorithm remove a child?
Predictive AI models are increasingly being deployed in child welfare systems globally, with tools like the Allegheny Family Screening Tool in the U.S. serving as the blueprint. These algorithms are designed to run risk assessments on families. But here is the critical flaw. They mine data from public assistance programs. They look at SNP benefits, Medicaid usage, public housing records, and welfare interactions.
Wait, so the algorithm is primarily trained on data generated by people living in poverty, because wealthy people using private doctors and private schools aren't generating that specific public data stream.
Exactly. The algorithm conflates the structural struggle of poverty with the likelihood of child neglect. It mathematically equates being poor with being a danger to your children.
That's terrifying.
This allows the state to target marginalized, impoverished families for preemptive intervention and removal before any actual maltreatment has ever occurred. It is the automation of structural violence, disguised as objective data science.
And the materials also discuss something called genealogical nullification algorithms. What does that mean in practice?
Think about the massive rise of AI-driven family tree software, DNA databases, and digitized government record systems. These digital architectures are typically trained on standard normative datasets. They assume a simple binary biological lineage.
So they don't account for adoptees.
Right. They completely fail to account for what the author calls the adoptee paradox, the reality of an individual belonging to two distinct lineages, but legally fully belonging to neither.
So what happens when an adoptee's data hits these systems?
The software often legally and digitally invalidates their biological ties. Because the state's amended birth certificate says the adoptive parents are the biological parents, the digital systems scrape that legal fiction and treat it as ground truth.
Oh my.
The algorithm literally hard-codes the erasure of the adoptee's biological reality into the foundational digital architecture of the future. The erasure becomes permanent, automated, and unquestionable.
It is epistemic violence, but automated and infinitely scalable. So we have deconstructed the absolute nightmare of this system. We've looked at the micro-level trauma of financial blackmail and inverted grief. We've looked at the macro-level failures of the Attorney General's deflection, the VE key sector ignoring the crisis, and the algorithms automating the erasure. What is the answer? We need to look at the human rights imperative and the ultimate solution proposed in these documents.
The sources are unequivocal on the solution, and it is entirely actionable. The core demand from the advocates is the immediate establishment of a National Social Justice Commissioner for family separation and reconnection.
This circles back to that initial letter from the Attorney General.
Yeah.
The advocate wasn't just complaining about the system. They provided a detailed structural blueprint for a solution. Why is this specific, dedicated commissioner role the ultimate fix?
Because it is the only mechanism powerful enough to shatter the three walls of institutional silence we discussed earlier. A dedicated national commissioner would have the explicit statutory mandate to cross jurisdictional silos.
So they wouldn't be stopped by the state boundaries.
They wouldn't be stopped by the federal-state divide. They wouldn't age out at 18 like the children's commissioner. They would be legally responsible for overseeing the full lifelong continuum of family separation trauma, from infant removal to adult reconnection.
Let's talk about the teeth of this role. What would their actual operational powers be?
They would have the authority to drive the harmonization of state records legislation. That means they could pressure state governments to finally repeal those archaic secrecy laws in places like Victoria.
Finally getting access to the truth.
They would mandate national data reform, compelling bodies like the AIHW to track lifelong qualitative outcomes, measuring reconnection efficacy and adult well-being, rather than just tallying up finalizing adoption events. And crucially, they would enforce state and federal accountability based on binding international law.
The sources specifically anchor this demand in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, specifically UNCRC Article 8. Let's unpack that.
Article 8 is fundamental. It guarantees the absolute right of the child to preserve their identity, including their nationality, name, and family relations, as recognized by law without unlawful interference.
Okay, that's clear.
But more importantly for our discussion, it includes a positive obligation on the state. If a child is illegally deprived of some or all of the elements of their identity, the state is obligated to provide appropriate assistance and protection to speedily reestablish their identity.
But as we've seen, the current Australian system does the exact opposite. It actively obstructs that reestablishment. They seal the original records in a vault, they issue fictional birth certificates, and they demand you spend years in a Supreme Court fighting your adoptive parents just to discharge the contract.
Which is exactly why the commissioner is non-negotiable. The debate fundamentally centers on transitioning the system's entire philosophical goal. Right now, the child welfare system prioritizes legal permanence, the creation of an airtight, unchallengeable legal contract of custody that protects the state and the adoptive parents.
And what does the advocate propose instead?
The advocate argues that we must radically shift the goal to lifelong relational permanence, fostering stable, authentic, caring relationships, and protecting the individual's true identity regardless of the legal custody arrangement.
And a commissioner would also be responsible for overseeing redress and reparations, correct? Because the materials highlight that the current redress schemes are capped, disjointed, and deeply inequitable.
Yes. The argument is that redress must be uncapped and lifelong. You cannot put a 6-session cap on Medicare-funded therapy for a complex trauma that altered your neurobiology and attachment patterns from infancy.
6 sessions is practically an insult for CPTSD.
Exactly. A national commissioner would enforce national standards for uncapped, specialized trauma-informed counseling and provide fully funded state-assisted records tracing to help adoptees find their families.
If this commissioner actually existed, it would mean the end of what the primary source beautifully and tragically calls the soughtless delineation of society. It would force the state, finally, to look the adoptee paradox in the eye. It would mean putting an end to the 13 years of empty performative apologies since 2013 and actually doing the work.
It would signify the critical transition from public relations management to rigorous structural human rights enforcement.
There is a heavy poetic concept mentioned in the primary source note, referencing what the author calls the Bridge Walker series. It speaks to the immense, invisible, emotional cost of advocacy. The survivors of this system are forced to walk a precarious bridge between the absolute truth of their biological origins and a society that is violently determined to ignore them.
It's exhausting just thinking about it.
They have to maintain a soul-led resistance against a colossal bureaucratic machine that is designed to stay silent in the face of their truth.
It requires a nearly unimaginable amount of internal, spiritual power to constantly confront a system that views your very existence, your simple human desire for your own truth and history, as a fundamental threat to its legal and moral authority. The state demands they disappear into the fiction, and they refuse.
This raises what I think is the most important question for you, the listener, as we wrap up this journey. If we can sit here, look at the historical data, read the letters, and acknowledge the evidence, if we acknowledge that state-mandated family separation is a lifelong, cross-generational human rights crisis that alters brain chemistry, shatters families, and destroys true identities, why do we tolerate a governmental system that continues to treat it like a one-time, finalized administrative paperwork event? Why do we let them just file away the trauma in a cabinet and pretend the job is done?
We tolerate it because treating it as an administrative event protects the system, the politicians, and society at large from catastrophic moral and financial liability. It is infinitely easier for a bureaucrat to file away a piece of paper than it is to acknowledge the lifelong task of healing a shattered human soul.
We have covered massive, difficult ground today. We started at the deeply personal, micro-level trauma of an adoptive mother weaponizing her inverted grief, using financial blackmail against her child for simply wanting to know their own biology.
And we traced how that intimate domestic coercive control is not an anomaly. It is actively enabled and protected by macro-level bureaucratic deflection from the Attorney General's Department, by the VET sector deliberately ignoring the trauma in its national paracurriculum,
By the massive fraud of ghost colleges flooding the NDIS with unqualified workers.
and by archaic state laws fiercely protecting the legal fiction of the amended birth certificate.
It is a meticulously constructed architecture of institutional silence. And whether you are listening to this deep dive as a legislative policymaker with the power to draft new laws, an independent researcher looking for the gaps in the data, or an adult care leaver who has spent your entire life fighting against this suffocating societal denial, this knowledge is power.
It really is.
It empowers you. You can now clearly see the blueprint of the walls they put up to keep you out. You can identify the bureaucratic absorption, you can spot the moral shielding, and you understand the intentional data deficits. And seeing the architecture is the first vital step to dismantling it. It is how you demand true structural reform, a national commissioner with real teeth, rather than accepting yet another superficial, unfunded apology.
The ultimate demand here is for adoptee sovereignty. It is the fundamental human right to own your own history, your own biology, and your own truth.
I want to leave you with one final expansive thought to mull over long after this finishes. We started this deep dive talking about your identity as your computer's operating system, your foundational source code. As we huddle toward an unprecedented era of predictive AI, algorithmic family removals, and the permanent digitization of government records, we are standing at a critical societal crossroads.
A very dangerous crossroad.
Will we allow this new wave of digital colonialism to permanently hard-code these false, amended legal fictions into the very fabric of our future data systems, erasing biological reality forever with the stroke of an algorithm? Or will we finally recognize adoptee sovereignty, grant them full access to their original source code, and use our technology to build indestructible bridges back to the original truths they were violently forced to leave behind?
The system relies on the dark to survive. It will only change when that silence is permanently broken.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.